It was a quiet summer night in 1991 when 6-year-old Emily Carter vanished from her bedroom without a trace. Her parents, Laura and Mark, had tucked her in like any other night, kissed her forehead, and turned out the light. But by morning, her bed was empty, the window slightly ajar, and the only sign of anything unusual was her favorite stuffed bear left lying on the floor. Police and neighbors searched for weeks. Helicopters flew overhead. Flyers were posted across town. But Emily was gone. No leads, no answers. Just an overwhelming silence that stretched for years. Laura never gave up hope. Even after investigators moved on and people in town stopped talking about it, she kept Emily's room exactly the same. Dust settled on untouched toys. Books remained neatly stacked on the shelf. And her little pink tape recorder sat on the nightstand, right where she left it that night. That recorder had always been one of Emily's favorite things. She used to sing into it, tell stories, even talk to her imaginary friends. 9 long years passed. Then one rainy afternoon, while cleaning, Laura picked up that old recorder and pressed play. She expected to hear static or maybe one of Emily's old lullabies. But what came out made her freeze. It was a voice clear, recent, and definitely not from 1991. Her hand trembled as she replayed it, trying to make sense of what she was hearing. That's when she realized Emily's story wasn't over yet. Laura sat on the edge of the bed, clutching the recorder, her heart pounding like it hadn't in years. She pressed play again. The voice was faint, but unmistakably older, like a young girl trying to whisper something important. Mom, ... I miss you. I'm still here, ... double quotes, then static. Laura stared at the toy in disbelief. She hadn't touched it in years, and there was no way Emily could have made that recording as a child. But who else could it be? The toy still had the original cassette inside, and the batteries were long dead. So how did it play? That night, Laura called the detective who had led the original investigation, James Rowland, now retired. He was skeptical at first, but when he came over and heard the recording for himself, his face went pale. It's not from the original tape, he said quietly. And it definitely wasn't there in 91. The two began going over everything again the night Emily disappeared. The search, the lack of evidence. One neighbor had seen a strange van parked down the road that night, but the lead went nowhere. Another odd detail. Emily's bedroom window lock had been found broken, but there were no fingerprints. Now, with this recording, everything was suddenly shifting. Was someone playing a cruel trick? Or had Emily somehow reached out? All these 6 years later, through the one thing she'd loved most. The more Laura listened to that whisper, the more certain she became. Emily was trying to tell her something. Laura couldn't sleep that night. The voice from the recorder echoed in her mind, haunting and delicate. She found herself sitting at the kitchen table at 2 a.m., flipping through Emily's old drawings, school papers, anything that might hold a clue. One crayon drawing caught her Aja red van parked under a crooked tree. At the time, it seemed like any child's imagination, but now it felt different. The same crooked tree still stood near the old service road behind their neighborhood. The next day, Laura returned there for the first time in years. The road was overgrown, unused, and strangely quiet. As she stepped through the weeds, she noticed something metallic reflecting in the sunlight. It was a rusted bracelet, one exactly, like the one Emily wore the day she disappeared. Her breath caught. She picked it up with shaking hands and stared down at the engraving. Love, Mom. It had to be Emily's. But how did it end up here, after all this time? Detective Rowland met her later with the news that the recorder's tape was examined by a sound technician. There were faint background noises, wheels turning, soft humming, and a male voice, distorted but present. We need to consider this wasn't just a disappearance, Rowland said. What if someone's been holding her this whole time? Meanwhile, across town, an elderly man watched Laura from a distance. He held a second recorder in his hand, one identical to Emily's, and pressed play. A girl's voice whispered, "She's close, but he won't let me go." Laura couldn't shake the feeling that someone was always watching her. Every time she left her house, she sensed eyes on her. The air around her felt heavier, like the truth was just out of reach. She kept playing the recording over and over, focusing on the faint noises in the background. A sound technician enhanced the audio again and caught something new, a low, rhythmic clanging, like chains or metal gates. It reminded Laura of the old train yard just a few miles from town, now abandoned and fenced off. She told Detective Rowland, who promised to follow up. But by the next day, he hadn't returned her calls. That night, Laura found a small envelope tucked into her mailbox. No return address. Inside was a grainy Polaroid of a young girl with wide, frightened eyes. She was sitting in what looked like a dimly lit basement, and in her lap was the same recorder Laura had found. The girl looked older than Emily had been, but the eyes, those unmistakable eyes, told Laura it was her, fueled by a mix of hope and dread. Laura drove to the train yard alone. She parked far from the gate, heart racing. The area was still, the silence broken only by wind rattling the old metal structures. She climbed through a hole in the fence, flashlight in hand, stepping cautiously over rusted tracks. From somewhere deep inside the shadows, she thought she heard it, a soft, broken melody, like a lullaby. And then a sudden scream that stopped. Her cold dot, Laura froze. The scream echoed for just a second, but it was enough to send a chill through her entire body. She swung her flashlight toward the sound, but there was nothing, just rows of decaying railcars and crumbling buildings. Still, the lullaby hadn't stopped. It was faint now, as if drifting through the air from somewhere beneath her feet. She moved slowly, carefully stepping toward a rusted loading dock. That's when she noticed a strange grate beneath a pile of debris. Kneeling, she cleared the rubble and found what looked like a trapdoor. It was sealed shut with an old padlock, one that looked recently added. Suddenly, her phone buzzed. One message, unknown number. It read, "Asterisk, you're too late. Walk away or she disappears again." Asterisk, her hands shook as she stared at the screen. Someone knew she was here, watching her, maybe even controlling every step she took. Back at her house, Laura's sister had stayed behind to watch the place, found something disturbing. Inside the mailbox, another unmarked envelope had arrived. This one contained an old school photo of Emily with a message written on the back in shaky handwriting. She remembers everything now. Laura was no longer dealing with just a kidnapping. Whoever had Emily wasn't hiding in fear. They were playing a game that had been in motion for years. And now, with Laura one step closer to the truth, the danger wasn't just for her missing daughter. It was for anyone who tried to help bring her home. Laura didn't leave. She couldn't, not with the trapdoor right in front of her. Ignoring the warning, she pried the lock with a crowbar she had grabbed from her trunk. It took all her strength, but finally, the metal snapped. She pushed the door open and was hit with a wave of musty, cold air. A narrow staircase led into the darkness. Clutching her flashlight tighter, she descended slowly, each creak of the wooden steps louder than the last at the bottom. The space opened into a large underground room, walls lined with old furniture, tattered blankets, and children's toys. In the corner, a figure stirred. Laura's breath caught. It was Emily. Older, thinner, her hair longer, but her eyes were the same. She looked up, confused, frightened, and then whispered, "Mom." Tears blurred Laura's vision as she rushed to her daughter, pulling her into her arms. But before they could say another word, footsteps echoed from above. Someone was coming. Laura pushed Emily behind her, ready to protect her at any cost. But when the shadow appeared at the top of the stairs, it wasn't the man from the photo or a stranger, it was Detective Roland. "I told you not to dig," he said, calm and cold. "You should have listened." In that moment, Laura realized the man she had trusted for years had been part of the very secret that stole her daughter. Emily clutched her tighter, and Laura knew getting out would be even harder than finding. Her had been not Laura stood frozen, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. Emily's grip tightened around her waist as Roland slowly descended the stairs. But just as he reached the last step, a loud crash sounded from above. Flashlights cut through the darkness, followed by shouts back up. It was Laura's sister. She had grown worried when Laura stopped responding and called in a tip using her connections from a former local reporter job. Within moments, uniformed officers stormed the space. Roland raised his hands, his calm demeanor cracking for the first time. He was arrested on the spot, his secret life beginning to unravel as investigators searched the underground hideout. They found journals, tapes, and files of evidence that this wasn't an isolated case. Roland had spent years manipulating cases, hiding truths, and controlling information. Emily had been kept alive, moved from place to place, convinced no one was looking for her. But despite it all, she had survived. She was stronger than anyone. Imagined, back home, Emily was reunited with the rest of her family. She barely spoke at first, but one night, while sitting on the porch, she turned to Laura and said, "I knew your voice would find me."